The United States warns of further action after its airstrikes on Syria. At the same time, talk of a political transition in the war-torn country has resurfaced. But is that even a possibility? Where does the solution lie? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Laura Kyle. US President Trump has been both congratulated and condemned for ordering missile strikes on a Syrian airbase suspected of using chemical weapons. The attack was seen by some as a warning to the regime of Bashar al-Assad that the period of impunity is over and he will be punished. But the past 6 years have shown that military action has failed to stop the mass killings and end the war. France and Germany have renewed calls for a political solution. But what kind of roadmap will be accepted by the main players in the conflict? Last year, the opposition rejected a United Nations proposal that had President Assad remaining in the political system. Last month, negotiators at a fifth round of peace talks brokered by the UN in Geneva called for a political transition, a new constitution and elections within 18 months. But considering previous opposition, can a compromise be reached, and what is the realistic way to proceed? Well, the war in Syria has multiple players and it seems everyone has a stake. So let's take a look at some of those involved. Russia backs the Assad government and has deployed members of its army to help forces loyal to the Syrian president. Iran is another Assad supporter. Tehran has been providing funds and weapons. Those against the Syrian regime include Saudi Arabia and the United States, who have been financing and training some of the rebel groups. Then there's Turkey, Syria's neighbour, which has taken in millions of Syrians escaping the violence. Turkey backs the Free Syrian Army, which has not only been fighting against the government, but also battling ISIL in the north. And the umbrella group, the High Negotiations Committee, or HNC, has represented much of the opposition in numerous peace talks. Let's now bring in our guests. In Jeddah, we have Hadi al-Bahra, member of the Syrian opposition and former president of the National Coalition of Syrian Revolution and Opposition Forces. In Beirut, Rami Khouri, public policy fellow and professor at the American University of Beirut. And in Moscow, Alexei Klebnikov, a Middle East expert at the Russian International Affairs Council. Welcome, all of you. Thank you very much for being here with us on Inside Story. Let's take a look at some of the recent developments over the last couple of days. We've got France and the UK saying that this US strike serves as a warning to Russia to now push for a political solution. Alexei, how likely is this to actually happen?
Firstly, I want to underline that from Russia's perspective, this is seen as definitely not a good start for any negotiations and for the political process in general. Firstly, because this US strike is largely perceived by the opposition and by the regional actors who are backing the opposition, like Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, as the US move, which is supposedly will give more backing to them. So basically now they will wait some continuation, some further pressure from the US side on Russia, on Iran. So it is unlikely that this will lead to any breakthrough or more constructive talks between Syrian opposition and Syrian government.
Hadi, is that a view that's shared by you and the opposition generally?
No, we see this action as a new set of rules which change the basics of the struggle in Syria. It shows that the US is coming back strongly to play a part in finding a solution to the crisis. We know the regime still will act resilient. It will increase its violence by using conventional warfare. But at the end, Russia has to rethink its policies and find a way to act positively and interact with the international community in a way to find out a real political solution for the crisis.
Rami, from your position there in Beirut, you can see both sides, I'm sure. How does the US action potentially change the situation? Does it push for a political solution at the negotiation table? Or does it, as Russia says, undermine any political solution?
Well, it probably doesn't do either of those things. The United States has been using military force directly or indirectly in the whole Middle East and the wider Middle East all the way into Afghanistan for about the last 35 years. And all we've seen in that period is greater chaos, greater warfare, greater refugees, more terrorism, and Al-Qaeda and ISIS and movements like that being the fastest growing political segment in this whole region. So American militarism, like Russian militarism, like Iranian militarism, like Saudi or British or anybody externally who comes into an Arab country using military force has generally, with rare exception, created more chaos and more problems, retarded any political solution possibilities, and generated new forms of extremism and desperation. Now, this is probably just a one-time shot by the Americans, more really related to Trump's internal political standing and his need to show how tough he is and to differentiate himself from Obama. It's probably not the beginning of a long-term change in American policy.
Interesting, though, Rami, if I just stay with you for a moment, looking at potential change in US policy, because we have seen something of a shift at the beginning. Trump and the administration suggesting that Assad could perhaps be part of the solution. Now we're hearing very clearly that he couldn't be.
Well, if you look at Trump's statements and actions on the Middle East in the last, say, 4 months, sort of before and when he won the election and afterwards, he has changed about every 2 weeks. It's quite incredible how dynamic and fluid his Middle East policies are, because he doesn't really have a Middle East policy. He doesn't have a Syria policy. He doesn't have an Iran policy. He only has domestic policies which are emotionally based, geared to a small constituent in the United States. So he will change these positions as he goes. His reaction to the chemical warfare, chemical weapons attacks was obviously quite sincere, as everybody was when we all saw those pictures. It was horrifying. And he reacted as a normal human being. But his conduct as an American president remains to be seen, whether it's part of a long-term policy or not. And this is one of the great challenges for everybody in the Middle East. Unlike, say, the Iranians, the Russians, and others, the Saudis, maybe even the Turks to some extent, we know they have long-term policies and they continue to pursue them. We don't really know what the American policy is, and this is not a moment, I think, when he is going to chart out a new long-term policy.
Okay, but Alexei, does it not send a very clear message to Assad that he might not be in quite as strong a position as he and the Russians think that he is?
So basically, I agree with my colleague from Beirut that definitely Trump's action is should be perceived as a and it is a one-time action, but definitely it aimed to sending several messages. The first message was definitely targeted at his domestic audience to confirm that he is not Putin's puppet and to tune down his critiques about his Russia affairs. Second message was sent to Moscow that Russia cannot unilaterally act in Syria anymore. And the third message was sent to the world that America is still here, it is in charge, and it can take decisive action. So given that, of course, this is an additional pressure on Assad, which might basically make him be more convinced to negotiate in a more constructive manner. But it hardly be so in the reality, because every time some military action takes place during the negotiation, especially when we look at the new Astana process and then Geneva process, I don't think that it gives opens up more opportunities for constructive negotiations.
Okay, because of course we have seen Russia acting quite unilaterally when it comes to Syria, and more so back in January when it produced a draft constitution for Syria, which was widely criticised by many Syrians. That stated that everyone shall have the right to life, security and freedom, and the state shall guarantee these rights. The army and other armed forces may not be used as an instrument of suppression of the people and should not interfere in politics nor participate in the transfer of power. The creation of armed units based on sectarian values will not be allowed, and such organisations will not be part of the social and political system in Syria. Quite a bold move. Hadi al-Bahra there in Jeddah. What was the Syrian reaction to that draft constitution that came out of Moscow?
It was a real surprise that Russia would do this. As you know, the constitutions are written by the people in Syria. It shouldn't be interfered by any outside source. We have, as an opposition in Syria, many qualified people. We have 3 or 4 drafts that has been developed before, and we really don't expect any foreign power to rewrite our constitution. Our constitution has to be written by Syrians and voted on by referendum by all the Syrian people.
Alexei, is that what happened to that draft constitution? Is it still a working document? Is it still being brought into negotiations?
Well, let me first underline that Russia never pushed this draft resolution as this draft constitution as something which should be or must be adopted by the Syrians. So even official announcement put it as a starting point for negotiations. So if we look at any modern constitutions, draft constitutions, they're all basically driving from one universal sort of set of articles. So basically, this was only the beginning, the starting point for discussions. So to say, to push to activate the process of political discussion of the constitution, but to no degree it was the move which prescribes or makes Syrians to adopt it as the granted.
But it didn't get very far, did it? It didn't really have the desired effect.
Right, but I mean, the situation on the ground is still very complicated, and with this current chemical attack and the U.S. strike, it complicated the situation even more. So I think this the discussion of the constitution is now moved even farther from the moment.
Rami, let's get to the crux of today's discussion, which is supposed to be on what a political solution would look like if indeed it is possible to find one at the moment, and many would say that we're a long way from it. But a transitional government, what would it look like?
Well, it's up to the Syrian people to decide that, and hopefully they'll have a chance to do so. The Syrian people are very talented, very reasonable, very cosmopolitan, very tolerant, very pluralistic. They have a tremendous modern and ancient history behind them. So if they are given an opportunity to shape their own governance system and their constitution, they shouldn't have any real problem doing it if they're left alone to do it. The problem now is that after these last 6 years of terrible warfare, ethnic cleansing, siege, bombing, starvation, chemical weapons, 11 million people displaced or refugees, there's been so much internal pain by Syrians against Syrians, as well as by external actors, that there's been huge fragmentation and polarization within the country. Something like 1 million people are living in other people's houses, incredible changes in population structure, and it's very difficult to put that Syria country back together as it was before. It's impossible to do it under the Assad regime. It's impossible to do it under any regime that's controlled by outside powers, whether they're American or Russian or Iranian or Saudi. So this is the huge, huge challenge facing the Syrian people. But we know that there has to be decentralization, there has to be more local control than central control, and there has to be strong commitment to a combination of transitional justice as well as equal rights for all people. The Syrian people would go for that, there's no doubt about it, and we know that from surveys and polling and studies that have been done among the refugees. The problem is that that day is not on the horizon. There's no sense that the Astana or the Geneva talks are anywhere near getting to a point where a real discussion about a transition to a new Syrian governance system can take place. And as long as the external powers from every direction are fueling the fighting more than, or directly engage in the fighting, as the Americans, Russians, Iranians, and others, and Turks are, there's no chance at all that there's going to be any serious discussion of a transitional government. And this is very distressing for the Syrian people above all, but also for the whole rest of the region.
Hadi, do you share that view that at this point in time there's no real point in having this discussion about a transitional government because, as Rami says, it's not even on the horizon?
We have to see reality. Reality is that the opposition is ready for a political resolution. We have dealt positively all through the preliminary talks with the representative of the UN. The core problem issue in the negotiation that still there is no real negotiation. There's no negotiation among the government party and the opposition. There are talks, consultation with the UN representative, but not real negotiation. We don't have a partner on the other side of the table who is seriously looking for a political resolution. We have still the Assad regime who is convinced still that he could achieve a military resolution, a military winning, and this is a dream he cannot achieve. It will prolong the crisis. It will destroy whatever left of Syria. So the core issue now is the international community, and mainly I talk about two countries, the US and Russia, ready to put the required pressure to move forward ahead with a real negotiation, achieving the aspirations of the Syrian people.
Okay, if we look at the international community, Hadi, I mean, of course, one of the main obstacles to a political solution is the future of Assad. But what appetite is there now amongst the international members for Assad being part of the beginnings of the transition at least?
If we are serious about achieving a political resolution to the crisis, there would be enough pressure applied on Assad to leave power at the start of the transition period. Before the transition period, the preparatory period, or whatever period is, this is open option for Syrians to talk about and decide on it. But for sure, as your guest said, you cannot Assad cannot establish stabilization and security in Syria. He cannot put back the country together. Assad cannot win peace in Syria. The continuation of Assad will bring more suffering to the Syrian people, more security risk to the international community. That's all.
Alexei, will Russia ever accept that there is no place for the Assad regime in a transitional government?
First, I have to say that Russia never connected and was really connecting its plans in Syria to the personality of Assad. What Russia really cares about is its interests. So as far as the person who is in power can protect Russia's interests in Syria, Russia will be fine with that. So the major concern of Russia is to save the existing state institution, army, which is one of the most important of them, and all others. I mean, if we look currently at the territories under control of the Syrian government, you can see that the majority of people still live under the government control areas, where basic institutions are still functioning, still running. So this is the major concern. As for the personality of Assad, Russia numerous times reiterated that it doesn't connect its Syria strategy policy to his personality. Also, I want to comment on one thing that my honorable colleagues mentioned, that the external powers should push more pressure on the relative participants, actors of this conflict. But we should keep in mind that the external powers do not have that much real influence on the groups on the ground. When we talk about the United States really have little influence. I mean, for the last 5 years, U.S. failed to create cohesive, not fragmented opposition. So this notorious fund and equip program failed. And basically this idea of separating moderate rebels from terrorists also was not, I mean, it didn't come into life.
Okay.
So
let me just put that point to Hadi, because it's a fair point that, you know, we haven't even got the rebels united at the negotiating table in Geneva. In Astana we saw, well, in Geneva we saw the HNC, and then we saw Moscow and Cairo camps. It's not one voice yet, Hadi. So how do you first overcome that?
That's what I said when I said there is still no real negotiation carried out in Geneva.
Right.
The whole negotiation process has to be redesigned, reconfigured in a way to have two delegations sitting in front of each other. The way forward, it's known by everybody. We want to establish a transitional governing body which unite the internal front of Syria, so we can carry out the fight against terrorism and get rid of terrorists and the extremist organization in Syria, unite and reconcile the internal front of Syria, and carry forward with full political transition, achieving democracy, multipolar system, a city, a country governed all on equality between all citizens and their rights and duties. So the way forward is very well known. Even it's shared by the majority of the Syrians. The problem is we have one main external power, which is Iran, which has no interest of achieving any political resolution to the crisis. It wants the continuation of Assad alone in the regime. This is what they care about, because they built their relation with Syria, not with the people of Syria, but with one man who is the Assad, Bashar al-Assad. So they make obstacles. They try not to pressure on the regime, but also to push the regime toward a military solution instead of political solution.
Rami, we've got Astana and Geneva, another round due at the beginning of next month, the beginning of May. Do you see a new negotiating framework happening?
I think there's no real sign of that now. I think negotiations will continue because everybody, including the government in Syria, the rebels, the international parties involved, they all would like to have a ceasefire to stop the war, to have some humanitarian relief, and just to stabilize Syria. Everybody would like that to happen. So they'll keep talking about it. But the real negotiations are happening on the ground with the guns. And this is the unfortunate reality we have to live with. The other point I'd add is that if you look at the external players, it's really only the Russians, the Iranians, the Turks, and Hezbollah that have had a clear and consistent position on the ground. They know what they want to do, and they've been focused on doing it. The other external actors, the US, the Europeans, the Saudis, and others, have been all over the place, not really clear about what they want, shifting partners, shifting strategies. And this is why we have the situation now where Assad has strengthened his position, but only with this massive external support is he still where he is. He's actually very weak. He seems strong, but he's not strong. He's only there because Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah are heavily supporting him in fighting and in economic aid and diplomatic aid. So we have a very brittle situation in Syria, and it's a situation where most people feel they just have to keep fighting until one of them gets an advantage. And of course, nobody's going to get an advantage because they're just going to keep destroying the country. So I sense that only really serious consensus by the external drivers of the warfare, if they can get together and find a minimum common ground that the internal parties in Syria can then agree on and formulate, can we ever hope to get any negotiation going seriously? But I don't think that's going to happen. And the last point, quickly, I'd say a lot of the power in Syria now is held by people at the local community level. Some of them are decent local people who govern. Some of them are warlords. Some of them are criminals. Some of them are involved in a war economy and smuggling, and some of them are linked to the terrorist groups. So there's a huge fragmentation of power, sovereignty, and legitimacy, and effective control of services on the ground in Syria that is not in the hands of Assad or the opposition or the Russians or the Iranians. And this makes it even much more complicated. But the Syrian people will solve this themselves if they're given an opportunity to. They're very able, and they know what they want.
OK, on that positive note, we will end our discussion today. Thanks very much to all of our guests for joining us here. Hadi Al-Bahra, Rami Khoury and Alexei Klebnikov. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, that's aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, do go to our Facebook page, that's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. There our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Laura Kyle, and the whole team here, bye for now.